Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Clifford Winston, a senior fellow of economic studies at the Brookings Institution. Clifford, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, the economy has been the top issue facing voters headed into this election, and we do have a bit of insight into both of the top candidates' economic agenda. Vice President Kamala Harris did unleash a proposal of what she would do with the economy. I know she's only been in the race for about a month, but here are some of her points. She's going to implement a federal ban on price gouging for food and groceries, provide $25,000 for down payment for first-time homeowners, get rid of taxes on tips, give families a child tax credit, cap prescription drug prices, invest in a $40 billion innovation fund with the purpose of finding rental and housing solutions, and restore middle-class tax cuts. When you hear some of those proposals, as an economist, what do you think?
All right. Well, I think maybe a different type of economist than you talk to on these shows. I like to take things slow, and that is start with a framework, right? And ask something that people rarely ask. What are the goals? What are you trying to do? Before sort of jumping into policies and saying, oh, this one's a good policy, this one's a bad policy, step back and ask yourself, what are the objectives? Okay. So if I can, let me just sketch a framework on how to think about policies and then apply it. All right. Because then I think things will follow in a logical way. Okay. So usually there are sort of two broad reasons why government intervenes in the economy and offers policy. One is to correct what we call market failures. There's some kind of inefficiency out there, monopoly, externalities, things of that nature, that the government wants to step in and correct because the market isn't doing it. Two, there are social goals. That is, markets aren't inefficient, but there are outcomes, allocations that they don't like. That is, markets may be paying people their, quote, appropriate wage, but the wages are still too low. And they want to enable these people to have a reasonable standard of living and give them more money. All right, so those are the two things. Then the question is, what are the policy tools? One policy tool is regulation, and the other policy tool is spending. Then the hard question, okay, what's the most efficient thing to do? That can then bring in the market. And the answer might be, look, stay out. Government shouldn't intervene. Just let the market sort this out. Or if the government does have a policy, then you ask a hard question. Is this the most efficient policy for the government to pursue? There might be room for government, but the way it's doing it isn't efficient. It's wasting resources. Okay? So that's the setup. Then we can now sort of talk about specific policy. So just as an example, we hear the term price gouging. Well, it's a little difficult for me to understand that because the economists tend not to use that term, but you hear discussions about it in the context of prices are too high, then there's some relationship to inflation, things of that nature you hear. Well, if the issue is inflation, then that's not a micro policy issue. It's a macro policy issue. So the first thing to point out then is if you're really worried about inflation, you need to have the right tool, and that tends to be macroeconomic policy, interest rates, for example. All right. So, discussions about inflation usually say, we want higher interest rates, slow things down, and cut price levels and slow down the economy. I don't think anyone wants to be doing that. They're talking about reducing interest rates. So it's hard to see, current discussions particularly relevant to inflation. Now, if you say, well, what we don't like about this is there's monopoly or collusion or some kind of anti-competitive behavior. All right, it'd be nice if there was some evidence, but even without that, the usual tool is antitrust policy. The government usually doesn't come in on markets and say, okay, we at the federal level are going to decide to do this without an antitrust investigation. All right. So, that's the kind of spirit in which I see a lot of these policies. It's not clear half the time what they're trying to do, and it's not clear, what tool, they're using, and is it the appropriate one. Now, to be fair, this has just been launched within a few weeks, and I think it's unreasonable really to look at Kamala Harris and say, well, she should have a well-crafted policy. A month ago, I think she wasn't thinking about even doing this. On the other hand, there is quite a lot of evidence about Donald Trump's micro policies because he actually went through this as president. And there we can analyze very specific things that he did and what we tend to think about his policies. And pretty much, I think it's fair to say that he ran the table on inefficient policies. Every one of them were not the kinds of things either that we should be doing, or if they were, we could be doing them a lot better. So if you're looking for a comparison, I think the track record of Trump is not good. Harris, I think, needs a bit more thought about what's going on. But obviously, what she's saying now and what she's going to do when she gets elected could be two very different things.
I want to compare their economic agendas in a moment. But before that, Vice President Harris did say that her goal is to strengthen the middle class. Based on what you've seen her say, and I know, as you said, it's only been a month, so she hasn't had much time to craft this, but she has been in the Biden administration for 3.5 years. So with that experience, paired with the things that she said, do you see this being, the right way or a solution to strengthen the middle class and create what she has called an opportunity economy?
All right, so let's go back to my framework and say, what are we trying to do? Economic goals or social goals, right? So you'd strengthen the middle class if you really thought there were some pretty significant market failures that were hurting the middle class. Hard for me to see that, with the exception really of climate change. And that affects all of us. So, to the extent that they have a concern about addressing that efficiently with some sort of carbon tax, is really what we tend to think about in economics, that would be a good thing for her to do. I haven't heard too much about that. The administration certainly talked about climate and moving ahead, obviously, with a more green economy. Those are good things, but again, we got to be careful, and we got to do them in an efficient way. If you just want to dole out more money to the middle class by cutting things left and right, you got to pay for that. And you've got to think through, okay, yeah, we can start writing new checks, but we're going to have to pay for these things. And, I've not heard sort of a cogent explanation of really how this is going to be financed. And so that's, my concern at this point. Regardless of whether her policies, whether there be subsidies for housing or reductions in taxes, do lead to people having more money in their pockets, there's the question down the road, how are you going to finance this?
I mean, that's a big question, and a less fun, less glamorous question that politicians want to answer when, they have a proposal. Well, how or who is going to pay for it? Based on what we've seen from Trump, based on what you've heard from Kamala Harris, is there any indication of how these are going to get implemented or who's paying?
Well, again, Trump has already implemented a lot of what he wants to do before, right? We've seen what he wanted to do and what he didn't want to do, right? He had no interest in pursuing any efforts to combat climate change, right? He did have an interest in putting in tariffs that economists have estimated were very costly for consumers, right? So if he continues with that, you can count on that to be harmful. You saw that his use of antitrust policy was more of a personal matter. That is, he really wasn't all that concerned with any anti-competitive issues as much as he was concerned with whether these companies were not supportive of him. And there's going to be payback if they weren't. in certain things. So that's sort of a flavor of where he was at. I think in the case of Kamala Harris, again, it's premature. I'd like to see, a more thorough discussion of how these things are going to be done. I mean, a big problem. Even let's go back to price gouging. The obvious problem with something like that, and again, this gets back to the efficiency of how you're implementing these things, is ideally you really want this thing means tested, right? There's no reason for someone like me to really be protected against supermarkets raising prices. I have no idea what prices are. When the supermarkets see me coming, they could double their prices and I wouldn't know the difference. I mean, simply because of ignorance, but frankly, it's not going to be costing me all that much. So ideally, we really would want to target this toward less affluent people, not let everybody in on it, right? That's wasteful, right? So those are the kinds of things that I would raise, even if she comes forward with a specific policy about price gouging. It's too broad. It needs to be means tested, as do a lot of these things, to make sure in the process of helping the middle class that you're really not subsidizing a lot of affluent people too.
I know that you're saying this is a bit premature because she has just become the nominee. She just accepted it literally last night, just stepped into this race about a month ago. But an aide reportedly did say that she's not going to stray too far from the Biden administration or Joe Biden when it comes to her economic vision, and that she's not going to move too far away from him on substance. Now, we've lived in now a Biden economy for 3.5 years. So from your perspective, when you hear that, what do you think?
Too much spending. Too much spending, not enough pricing. Now, again, this is something that, back to the framework, there are reasons that government gets involved with infrastructure. That'll be a big ticket item as far as this administration, right? We have, a $1 trillion plus capital stock in our infrastructure. Highways, airports, ports, all this kind of stuff. And it seems attractive politically to say we're going to spend more money to, make these systems more up to date, safer, all that kind of stuff. We're going to create new jobs. All good. There's one problem though. Before you go ahead and spend money, in the case of infrastructure, you ask the question, do we have the prices right? Right. Prices and infrastructure go together. And prices are a signal for investment. So take something else. Suppose you're producing oranges and selling them, and you're always running, and you price them low. And so you're always running out of them, right? And people say, well, we just need more money. We need to spend more money, and we can continue to provide oranges at this very low price. Well, maybe you want to think about pricing, and maybe you want to raise your prices aligned with cost, and you won't need to be spending so much money, right? Well, it's no different with infrastructure. Before we need to spend a whole lot of money on repairing roads, on widening roads, how about charging the users of the roads efficient prices? So the congestion pricing program that was just canceled was a tragedy. That's exactly the kind of thing that we'd like to see what New York was going to try to do. What impact did congestion pricing have on peak period traffic and its pressure that it puts on highway capacity, right? That would have been informative, and that's what we want. But there's other pricing too. Pricing trucks. Trucks are the ones who tear up the road. And there's certain prices that you can charge trucks based on axle weight that encourages them to distribute their load over more axles so they do less damage to the road. Okay? Set those prices in there. You won't damage the road so much. You don't need to spend so much money on repaving, reconstruction, so on and so forth. So that's the basic theme. Too much money, not enough efficient pricing with economic principles.
So as you said at the top right there, too much spending. But now when you compare that to Trump's economy from 4 years ago, some of the things that he proposed to bring back, what do you see as the biggest differences of the two?
It's a question of the different ways that at this point they're not applying economics, right? I think neither of them are carefully adhering to basic economic principles. There's nothing unusual about that in government as economists sit on the sidelines. I think they're different things. What is also striking is that as a Republican, one would expect Trump to be more sensitive to these economic concerns of waste and inefficiency. That's supposedly, what Republicans are about. And, it is not surprising when Democrats, who tend to be more supportive of spending, proceed in that fashion. So I think, in a sense, the Democrats are more faithful to their historical orientations of pricing, whereas Trump is hardly faithful to what Republicans have been doing in terms of limited government and restraint on pricing. I think that's really your sort of big differences in terms of the inefficiencies that both economic programs have associated with them.
Americans obviously are concerned about grocery store costs, the economy in general. So when they hear things from their politicians like, we're going to bring down inflation, we're going to cut taxes, we're not going to tax tips, I mean, that sounds great, but how are they going to implement this? Whose plan do you think is less of a pie in the sky plan and is, more realistic?
I think my plan, do nothing. And my think is that Harris is closer. Right?
But you're
essentially that's what let the market sort this out. And my point is this: I don't see evidence of what we call market failure that's leading to inflated prices from a micro point of view. I don't see collusion. I don't see these guys making, excess profits through some sort of monopoly pricing. Okay. Now, really, inflation normally is a macro problem, right? I think what we're discussing is really a question of price markups. But the problem with price markups in terms of analysis is oftentimes they can reflect efficiency. That is, firms reduce costs. And so the difference between their prices and their costs grows, but they're not raising prices. They're making a lot more money. Okay, so that's not necessarily a bad thing when they get more efficient and their markups go up. However, that's not really what's going on here either. I think there's just adjustments, as we often see with supply and demand. As I said, I don't know the specifics of particular commodities that have gone up, and then people say, the reason why they're doing this is X, requiring any kind of antitrust policy or some regulation. So I'm quite content to let the market sort this out. And frankly, I think if Harris gets in office, by the time she's there, we're not going to be doing anything about this. I think things will sort it out. At this point, inflation is actually quite low. We're a little bit more concerned with maybe keeping unemployment low. And so I think she'll be fine. Trump gets in, his interest in tariffs is crazy. I mean, we're going to have to pay a lot more for imported goods, but also inputs or resources that manufacturers and producers use. So that's your way of elevating prices.
Talk about that a little bit, because when he said that he's going to do raise tariffs on imported goods, economists didn't sound happy about that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean everything. Again, going back to what problem we're trying to solve, you always got to start with that. Okay. To him, the problem we have to solve is a balance of payments problem, right? He doesn't like it that we spend more money on what foreign people produce than what they spend on what we produce. All right. I mean, just think if Hawaii had that attitude. We spend money going to Hawaii, but Hawaii doesn't come to visit, where we are, right? I mean, it's crazy. And so he starts with that's a problem that we need to solve, right? So he wants to interfere in the, quote, foreign trade market, make their goods more expensive so we don't, quote, buy as much of them. But we are still going to buy some of them. And certainly producers still need some of them in terms of that's the best source of where they're getting inputs. That's going to increase your price level. It's no more complicated than that.
So essentially, I'm just boiling this down. What you're saying, if Vice President Kamala Harris is elected, you think the market will sort itself out. If Donald Trump is elected, you think that we could see some chaotic times in the economy ahead?
There's no doubt that he will intervene in the economy aggressively. Okay. Mm-hmm. I think Harris will, once she gets in, will take things slower. I think between now and then, I think it'll be clear that the market is sorting these things out and that she will not rush to a sort of grand plan. If anything, she may target it, let's say, trying to reduce the cost of housing. But even then, we'll have to think through what's the most efficient way to do it. I think there's a better chance of those kinds of outcomes. Trump has got his mind made up. He's done these things before. He will intervene. And I think these will have adverse consequences.
Well, as everyone, or by everyone, I mean as Vice President Harris, as Donald Trump unveil even more details from their economic agendas, I hope you come back on and break them down for me and my viewers. Clifford Winston, thank you so much for the conversation. You're welcome back anytime, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Okay, look forward to it.